If it's Wednesday, is the Biden administration about to take a page from the Trump playbook at the border? The White House bracing for a surge of migrants when a pandemic-era restriction expires in just 1 week. Plus, the crypto contagion. Congress looks for answers in the wake of one of the biggest financial frauds in American history. That's left a trail of dirty campaign money here in Washington. And the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to their highest levels in 15 years as policymakers continue to wage a war on soaring inflation. Is this the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning of these rate hikes? Happy Hump Day and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I am Chuck Todd here in Washington. We're going to begin today with the escalating political and humanitarian mess at the southern border, which is the Biden administration, believe it or not, looking to the Trump playbook for some solutions. The White House is bracing for a potentially major surge in border crossings because 1 week from today, the pandemic-era policy known as Title 42, which essentially allowed for just immediate border removals, is expiring via court order. The public health order allows authorities to turn away migrants, including asylum seekers, at the border, citing the need to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Since the restriction began, Title 42 has been used more than 2 million times to turn folks away. And as a result of the pending expiration, officials tell NBC News that the number of migrants crossing the border, which is already near record levels, may increase by as much as 33%. And that would mean an additional 2,500 crossings every single day on top of the 8,000 to 9,000 to 10,000 that we're seeing now. Both Republican and Democratic officials along the border have been sounding this alarm. Here's Texas Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar earlier this morning.
Communities are going to be overwhelmed, not only El Paso. We've seen that in the past with Rio Grande Valley. We've seen it in Eagle Pass, Del Rio. They're going to be overwhelmed. Title 42 goes away. This is going to just open up a lot of large numbers of people coming to border communities.
Congress can't agree on a legislative fix for the issue, leaving the Biden administration left to navigate this political third rail on its own. NBC News is reporting that the White House is considering a two-pronged approach to address the expected influx. It would include narrow pathways for some migrants to seek asylum, while drastically slashing eligibility for others. The plan, however, could face some fierce blowback from the president's own party because part of it is actually modeled after a so-called transit ban that was first put into place by one of the Trump administration's immigration hardliners, Stephen Miller. This would require migrants to prove they're likely to face torture if returned to their home country, or show proof they were denied asylum in a third country on the way to the border. My colleague Jacob Soboroff recently asked Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas if the Biden administration was considering a transit ban. Let's just say he didn't deny it.
Another way of describing it as a transit ban. Would you consider, as DHS Secretary, a transit ban?
I would have to see what is specifically proposed, to understand what it provides for, what it doesn't provide for. Let me say this. I believe profoundly, as does this administration, in our asylum system. It is one of our crown jewels, and we will continue to uphold it.
Gabe Gutierrez is live at the border in El Paso, Texas. He's been actually traveling from Mexico to the border today. Carol Lee is outside the White House. Gabe, we've been chronicling you all day today and what you've been doing. What did you learn about this? Who's coming to the border? Because it is not what people may assume. I know I read earlier there's a slew of Cubans coming to the border, a slew of Haitians coming to the border. Who did you see?
Hi there, Chuck. Good afternoon. Well, we didn't see that many Cubans, not that many Haitians. A couple of years ago, Chuck, and I know you've been following this for quite some time, there's a lot of Central Americans. Now, what we are seeing is a lot of Nicaraguans, a lot of Venezuelans. So over the past several days across the border from El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, where we were earlier today, there were hundreds of migrants lined up in these frigid conditions. The conditions got very cold overnight with the wind chill, and there were hundreds of migrants there, again, many of them from Nicaragua. And some of the ones that we've been speaking with say that they decided to cross now because they knew about Title 42 next week, and they fear that it might get too chaotic at the border, and they fear there may be some sort of shutdown. At least that's what they may have been told by smugglers or family members in their home countries. Others we talked to say that they weren't too familiar with U.S. policy and just were desperate to get to the U.S. So, Chuck, that's what we saw in Ciudad Juarez early this morning and yesterday. Behind me, this is El Paso, and this is right by one of the main shelters here. And there are migrants sleeping on the streets here because the shelter system is so overwhelmed. And local officials say that this is unsustainable. They are calling this a humanitarian crisis, and they want the federal government to do more. Just a short time ago, Chuck, I spoke with the director of Annunciation House here. He has been sheltering migrants in this community for decades, and he says this time is different. Take a listen. If and when Title 42 is lifted, what do you expect to happen?
I would imagine that the numbers will double, possibly triple. It is painful to not be able to respond to the numbers that are coming. When this facility gets full, they're still going to come to the door and say, can you give me a place to stay? And if it's a single adult, man or woman, you at least have a sense that you can vent. But when they bring children, it is beyond painful.
And so migrant advocates like Ruben Garcia, during the Trump administration, Chuck, they called some of the policies inhumane. Now they're saying that the Biden administration is not paying enough attention to the border and has let this get out of control and is not fully prepared for the lifting of Title 42. So again, these migrants right now, some of them, you know, they're going to end up in different parts of the country. We spoke with some that just didn't have the money to go anywhere. They're trying to meet up with relatives as they wait for their asylum claims to be adjudicated, Chuck.
Gabe, what's Mexico doing to help with this, or are they just helping to make sure people get to our border?
Well, over the last several months, Chuck, there has been more of a presence of Mexican security forces on that side of the border. Just about 2 weeks ago, there was a large migrant camp that was really right where we were this morning. That was broken up by the Mexican military. And we understand that Secretary Mayorkas has actually met with Mexican officials, and there are behind-the-scenes discussions to try and figure out exactly what to do next. But, Chuck, this is a problem that really has been going on for decades and has been going on for the last few years. So this is... There is a lot of questions about how this will move forward and how migration can be discouraged. Now, you mentioned our colleague Jacob Sobroff's interview with Secretary Mayorkas just a couple of days ago. You know, he said that in defending the Biden administration's policies here, Secretary Mayorkas says that we're seeing migration not just exclusively in the United States, but migration is up really throughout the hemisphere. And this is something that we're all going to have to deal with. But again, back to the local officials here in El Paso, they say that this is a moment of reckoning, that this is different, that this is a kind of an inflection point in the immigration debate, and they want something now done by the federal government here. And whether that involves some more working with the Mexican government, that remains to be seen, Chuck.
Gabe Gutierrez in El Paso, Texas now, after traveling across the border from Mexico. Gabe, thank you. Let me move over to Carol Lee. So, Carol, this is the definition of slow motion train wreck. This is something everybody knew was coming. The anticipation as the virus went away, as you couldn't use those health emergency laws in order to deal with the border. They've had 2 years to come up with a plan to do this. What is their plan?
Well, look, from the White House's perspective, what they're saying publicly, Chuck, is that they have asked Congress for funding. Now, the problem there is that Congress is not inclined to give them additional funding for this. It doesn't seem to be gaining any traction there. They've also said that they're coordinating with governments of Mexico, Guatemala, but that doesn't seem to be exactly where the administration would like it to be. And they're saying that they're dealing with, countering misinformation by smugglers and things like that. That's, according to experts, that's not going to cut it. And so what you're hearing from the White House now is that they're going to have other announcements in coming days. But what exactly those are really remains to be seen, and whether they work really will put the administration on the spotlight about competence, whether or not they can deal with something that, as you said, has been coming down the pipe. Everybody knew that this was going to be an issue. And, to the extent that they're looking at the Trump administration era policy, I think one of the things to look for there is for them to make the case that it's not exactly that in talking to administration officials. So we'll have to see. But this is a political problem for the president. It's one of them a problem that his aides have known about and are acutely aware of.
Right.
And yet there doesn't seem to be a very clear plan at this point in time.
Carol, do you get a sense that that's the problem, is that everybody keeps looking for a political solution and not just simply a solution? Like, I get the sense that, we already know, the many elected Republicans are afraid of the issue in primaries, so they don't want a solution. They just, at this point, they certainly don't want to compromise, because any compromise will upset their base. So they, status quo, are putting all the burden on the Democrats. But I feel like they're looking for a solution that becomes politically helpful rather than a solution that simply solves the problem.
Yeah, I mean, just to underscore your point, it's the vice president who was put in charge of dealing with this issue in terms of, they reframed it to say she was dealing with the root causes of that. But I think it'd be hard to make the case that she's really leaned into and grabbed onto this problem. And that's, to your point, that this is a political hot potato. Nobody really wants to address it or alienate any member of their own party. You have this Tillis Cinema framework for immigration reform that's going around Capitol Hill. The White House is not getting deeply involved in that. Hope they'll probably take credit for it if it were to go anywhere, but no one really thinks that it actually is. And so they're continue to be left with this problem. And now the administration is facing this question of whether or not it's competent enough to deal with this issue that they've known has been coming for a long time.
Carol Lee at the White House for us. Carol, thank you. So joining me now is Democratic Congressman Vicente González. He represents a portion of South Texas along the U.S.-Mexico border. So, Congressman, let me start with this idea that's being floated, clearly a trial balloon to see how politically toxic it could be. But if the administration raises the bar on asylum to torture, are you going to get tortured if we send you back home? And the answer is no, then fine, you can't seek asylum now. How do you feel about that?
Well, I got to tell you that our asylum laws are antiquated and they are being abused. The vast majority of people who come to our southern border are escaping poverty and not necessarily violence or the laundry list of things that are told our border. I've proposed something called the Safe Zone Act, which creates a zone on the border of Guatemala and Mexico, kind of like the green zone we had in Iraq, if you will. But it would have asylum seekers be able to be processed at that juncture. And if we're going to allow them in under the credible fear standard that we use now on our southern border, which is quite a low standard, then we should allow them in from this juncture or their home country. This should be a pilot program where they can, from there, fly into their final destination. And it would do two things. It would take the pressure off our southern border and allow the Border Patrol and law enforcement to do the job that they've been trained and hired to do. And it would also remove the cartel element that's charging these migrants $6,000 to $8,000 a head to get to our southern border. And it's the only proposal that I've seen so far that I think makes sense. I'm from the border. I understand what's happening on the border. I understand the abuse that migrants go through to get to our southern border. And it's also enriching cartels. We need to have a proposal, a plan. But we have to be honest with ourselves. The fact is, asylum laws that we have now are antiquated and are being abused. People are escaping poverty and are showing up to our border.
So should poverty be part of asylum?
I don't believe so. I think we should help economies around the world and help countries. There's a lot of poverty around the world, and we can't cure every single problem for everyone in every country. But I think more could be done for our neighboring countries like Central America. I think we should be addressing root causes and creating and making investments that create conditions for people to stay in their native country. It does seem as if everybody gets the word that, hey, if you want to get into the United States, the southern border is the way to go, right? If you're in Cuba, get to the southern border. If you're in Haiti, get to the southern border. If you're in Ukraine, get to the southern border. Your green zone idea seems like a good idea, but we're asking two other countries to agree to do this. That seems pretty difficult. So I've actually had this conversation with President Giamatti of Guatemala, who was in agreement with this. And I did this back during the Trump administration when President Morales was there. And I brought it back to the president, and there was interest at the White House at the time. But then COVID hit globally, and they triggered Title 42, and it really just put a Band-Aid on the problem. But until we have long-term infrastructure further away from our border, we're going to always be dealing with these situations. No, and it does. I mean, look, this feels like
a problem we all knew was coming, and we kept postponing it. Oh, look, Title 42 stayed into... I mean, it was just my test isn't due today. I don't have to turn the paper in for another 6 months. And then what do? We wait 5 months and 30 days. Oh, my God, what are we going to do now? I have to say, as looking at this from, average citizen, this feels like nobody in Washington wants to deal with this problem.
Yeah. Well, I do.
I know you do.
I border directly, and I have a plan. I've given this plan to the White House. It's a plan that makes sense. It's not a Democrat or Republican plan. It's an American plan to resolve the problems that we have on our southern border.
Would you be in favor of reinstituting Title 42 temporarily if it simply was about easing the border? You would?
Yeah, I've actually written letters to the president asking him not to lift Title 42. I mean, we're still not completely out of a pandemic. As you know, our numbers have doubled in the last few weeks. I mean, he has plenty of reason to not lift Title 42.
I was just going to say the current surge that we get an update every day about hospitalizations and cases on COVID. Let me just say the bar's red in like 45 of 50 states right now.
Right. That's right. I think the president has plenty of cover to keep Title 42 in place. And that gives us at the Congress and the White House time to come up with a real permanent solution.
Some of your colleagues in the House Republicans just want to make Secretary Mayorkas, attacking him as sort of dealing with the problem. Do you think this is anything to do with him, or is this just simply institutional?
It's institutional. I mean, Secretary Mayorkas has no doubt been in a very complicated place during a very complicated time, but we can't just target him for being the reason. In fact, I think Republicans use that as a distraction for not having a plan. The plan that I proposed is the only plan that I've actually seen on Capitol Hill that really addresses the asylum-seeking problem that we have on our southern border. And I haven't seen one single proposal come out of the Republican side. And I'll be clear about this. When Trump was in office, Democrats would go down to my border and point fingers at President Trump. When Biden's in office, I have a slew of Republicans going down there pointing the finger at Biden. And everybody uses the border as a political backdrop, regardless of what side is in power. What we need to do is come together as a country and come up with a proposal that will have a long-term solution to our southern border.
Congressman, you're speaking very rationally and logical. That usually doesn't go well in Washington. I think a lot of people hope that rationality and logic may kick in here. It seems like a very reasonable idea. Congressman Vicente González, Democrat from Texas, represents part of the border. Thanks for coming on and sharing that idea with us. Coming up, the latest on the scramble to avert a government shutdown ahead of Friday's deadline. And Kevin McCarthy still has a math problem. I guess he thought there wouldn't be math in any of this. Plus, how Sam Bankman-Fried's billions left a trail of dirty money in Washington. The latest on the fallout of one of the biggest financial frauds in U.S. history, which could turn into a campaign finance fraud. That's ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. We are back. Congressional negotiators say they've reached a bipartisan deal in a framework for a government funding package. As Congress tries to avoid a government shutdown when funding is set to expire this Friday, the government's not shutting down. And I know we always say, they have to avoid a shutdown. Yes, they're going to avoid a shutdown. The question is, are they going to fund the government a piecemeal, or are they going to fund it in a bigger way? Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell is supportive of the budget framework. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy says he is not, preferring to see Congress punt funding for next year when his party takes control of the House, and he hopes he wins the speakership. But McCarthy's speaker bid remains in danger from conservatives to his right, who haven't budged in their opposition, even in the face of lobbying by Donald Trump himself. That's according to some reporting out of the New York Times. So joining me now is our panel. Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino, NBC News contributor, Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason, and Republican strategist Matt Gorman. Jeff, it does seem as if Donald Trump's lobbying isn't working, is this a reflection on McCarthy or a reflection on Trump?
Or both. I mean, it's certainly a reflection of the numbers. The fact that their very, very limited victory in the midterm elections just didn't give him a lot more of a margin for victory. But I think you're right to ask that question. I mean, I think it's a reflection of Trump for sure. I mean, McCarthy is Trump's man.
These people don't feel like they have to deliver for Trump, do they?
They don't, and that's been sort of one of the main lessons of the last 2 or 3 weeks is that Trump absolutely, from his own rollout to the results of the midterm elections to what we're seeing with McCarthy right now, does not have the power that he used to have.
You know, Matt, he's got one senator that supports him. He's got a handful of House members now that happen to be, some of the House members don't like McCarthy, but the fact that his calls aren't working, I just think this is almost more reflective of Trump than McCarthy.
I agree. When I read that story, I thought the exact same thing. And look, I'm not saying that he absolutely cannot be the nominee, but saying that this is 2016 all over again, or, you know, we all counted him out before, I think that fundamentally discounts the current climate. And one of the biggest things for me is those strident voices are a lot less vocal now, along with, candidly, the party's just more indifferent to him, as we're seeing before. Not just the leaders, but the rank and file, too.
Maria Teresa, it does feel as if even when McCarthy becomes Speaker, he's going to be extraordinarily weak. Whatever it takes for him to become Speaker is going to put him sort of at the mercy of about 8 to 10 House Republicans.
Well, and I think that this is what he built. And I would say the same thing with McConnell. Had McConnell trusted his initial instinct and McCarthy their initial
pushing back at Trump,
pushing back at Trump in the beginning, they wouldn't be in this place. And I think you and I have talked about it, off camera. And now he basically, this is what he grew because he didn't have the political backbone. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see what are the compromises he's going to have to make if he does decide to split up this omnibus bill that we're seeing.
Yeah, I just, we'll see. I think we all know these guys want to get out of town. They're not shutting down the government. Yeah. They're going to agree to something. So I kind of feel like the minutia here is not worth diving deep into.
I haven't heard a word about it at the White House.
Yeah, nobody. They're not
on their radar.
No, but I think his calculation is that he's going to be all of a sudden having to talk about entitlement programs right before a presidential campaign where you're not going to want to.
No, I was just going to say he should secretly want all this cleared.
Exactly right.
You should want the decks cleared, wouldn't you?
Yes and no. Look, I think there's not going to be a ton done, but there will be leverage points, whether it's the budget fights, debt ceiling, farm bill, and others, where Republicans have some leverage. But you're right.
All right, I want to pivot to this border because this feels like an unforced error by the administration if this turns out to be a disastrous thing. Jeff, I made the point earlier. Nobody wants to solve this problem. Well, I'm not saying they don't, but everybody is afraid of the solution or proposing a solution because of the politics of this. The White House seems like that they're cowering over this problem.
I mean, I think it's not good timing ever for a crisis. It's probably really good for Biden that this is happening now instead of 3 weeks ago.
Or a month and a half
ago in terms of, it is an issue that, as we all know, Republicans will jump on and will no doubt make an even bigger issue going into the presidential campaigns that are going to start kicking off in the next few months. But unforced error indeed. And this president is in charge. The people in the White House now are in charge, and it's their problem to fix.
Right, Teresa, the fact that they have to consider a transit ban and that there's some openly talking about instituting Title 42, to me, that's reflective of they never had a plan in the first place, so they're now stuck with the tools that they can find.
Well, they're old tools, and they were blunt instruments that were put in place by the Trump administration, who had no, caring for the people that were going to be impacted. I do think, though, the fact that we are now depending on Sinema and Tillis to come up with a DACA bill.
Do you believe that's going to happen?
No. Well, I don't know, but the fact that
there's a lot of happy talk last week about it, not this week, is there?
Well, and that's the problem, right? So the fact that they have them there, I was in the steering committee today, and I heard that they're giving her 48 hours. This was the opportunity for the Democrats really to come in with some sort of immigration bill to at least deal with the other deal with Title 42, and they haven't, and I think that's going to be a problem.
Matt, the real issue is that there's not a lot of Republicans who think a compromise they can sell politically, and it feels like this is what we're trapped in. There's not enough Republicans who will play ball on sort of reasonable immigration reform because of the fear that anything you do, look at who's doing, anything you do, amnesty. Like, it just doesn't matter.
No, I think that's true. And I think one of the things, too, is it creates a contrast with the person you mentioned before. The point person is Kamala Harris, right? So they want that contrast going into a presidential election, especially when it's going to be, I think, one of the hot topics. And I think, to your point about the Biden administration, I think it's important that they not learn the wrong lessons. Just because the border wasn't a salient issue in 22 doesn't mean it won't be in 24.
Yeah, but the Democrats have to get out of the sandbox of the Republicans. They're actually playing into this. We actually have two issues in this country. We have the 11 million undocumented individuals and what's happening at the border. And that is when the moment that they can actually divorce those two and recognize that the path to the White House is how do you actually provide some sort of pathway of safety for the 11 million people here. Then they actually have an opportunity to say, okay, now let's figure out what the border is. Because that's a refugee problem. For the last two administrations, people have not paid attention to the southern border and to all the other countries in South America. And that is going to be something that we have to have a conversation on. How do we modernize our immigration system? But they have to divorce it.
What's interesting about you saying that is I think the Democrats did that a little bit on the issue of crime. During the midterm elections. The Republicans looked like they were gaining some ground on talking about crime, painting Democrats as weak on crime. And Democrats went back and said, we're for reducing gun violence. And the polls show that that is something that a lot of Americans are also for. And that was a pivot. And it was using the argument against the other party on an issue that actually has a lot of traction on both sides.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What is the immigration debate going to look like in a Republican presidential primary? Because there's really no disagreement.
There really isn't. And I think it's mainly going to be a point that you use against the Biden administration. It's an applause line. It's not something I think you're going to see in our Republican debate stage.
Nobody's going to put out a real serious proposal, are they?
I think on either side, right? Like we saw this in 2022. It's not like you're going to put out happy talking.
If you put out a plan, it gets
but I think
bad.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it also says it all the fact that the Biden administration continue the Trump-era policy. If Biden doesn't run or in the next series of Democratic primaries, that will be a cudgel, too.
This is what's amazing here, Maria Teresa, is that Stephen Miller's plan on the border is what's going to be implemented by the Biden White House.
I think the challenges of the class of Republicans that are coming in are so anti-immigrant that the Democrats have a chance to defang them. The people who are going to get most hurt are the undocumented families already living here. This is something that folks don't realize. In Arizona and in Nevada, Latino youth are the largest vote share of the Latino population. By 2024, we're expecting 160,000 Latino youth to turn 18 just in Arizona. Biden won that state by 11,000 votes. You know what their number two issue is after the economy? Immigration.
And what is it specifically? When you say immigration, what does that mean? Does it mean asylum? Does that mean the laws?
No, it means how do you keep my family safe? There are 16 million Americans who live in mixed status families, disproportionately Latino youth coming of age. So they mean that how do you actually how do you protect my TPS mom? How do you protect my dad? How do you protect my brother who's a DACA recipient? That is the fastest way to actually fix immigration.
All right, I want to pivot back to Republican presidential politics. New poll today, Ron DeSantis. With a double-digit lead, if the choice is just those two. Is that about DeSantis or Trump, that Wall Street Journal poll, Matt?
I think it's a lot about Trump right now. Again, you have to get to a one-on-one problem or one-on-one race. There's a long time between then and now. We talked about this, getting it down.
I believe Trump's number is 38% no matter what you do.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's a matter of how do you add up to that 52%. But look, if you're DeSantis, you play the issues that work for you, and that's COVID, that's down in Florida.
Well, it's funny you bring this up. I have to say, it's both remarkable and, some might say it's very cynical, Jeff. So he announces this sort of, I don't know what to call it, this kangaroo court on COVID and the vaccines on the day that he had to call a special session to deal with the single most unpopular issue for every homeowner, which is what's going on with property insurance. And it is not a deal that is worth bragging about. And he knows it, which is why I'm not surprised that when they had to admit that they basically are giving the insurance industry everything they want, please don't leave the state, please don't leave the state, he announces this. Politically, he knows what he's doing.
For sure.
I just wonder if he's buying time where someday that will bite him.
Well, and this ties in a little bit with your question before, which is this about DeSantis or is it about Trump? I think Trump's numbers are not great. His rollout hasn't been great. But Ron DeSantis, despite a lot of momentum right now, is still untested on the national stage. He's clever politically.
He's really
he does this kind of
fights 100%. And doing events.
Very strategic.
His governing record isn't that great.
And that this COVID investigation is no doubt part of that. But once he gets out on the stage more and gets asked about some of these things, he may come down from that that high.
So a lot of folks often say, why did so many Latinos vote for DeSantis? He kept their small businesses open.
That's right.
And the reason he's doing
right.
And so my guess is the reason he's doing this kangaroo report is that he's going to go to the wider lens of small business owners in America, and he recognizes that he is not a toxic brand like Trump is, and he's going to try to get the moderate independents and perhaps the business owners.
Yeah, no, look,
he's not dumb.
No, not at all. It's been really smart.
He's formidable.
But he does a good job of sort of making sure people don't see hey, pay no attention to what I had to do over here.
Yeah.
Jeff, Maria Teresa, thank you, and Matt. For more discussion on 2024, future of the GOP, download today's episodes of the Chuck Toddcast. Talk to a little Jonathan Martin and Blake Housewell. It's available wherever you get your podcast. Up next, a massive fraud scheme with massive legal, financial, and political consequences. One of the lawmakers investigating FTX's epic collapse joins me next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Sam Bankman-Fried, founder of the crypto exchange FTX, is in jail in the Bahamas right now after a judge denied his request for bail. The former CEO is expected to remain there until his extradition hearing in February. His lawyers are saying they will fight his extradition to the United States. As SBF's legal problems continue to mount, the political fallout also continues to rattle lawmakers here in Washington. Yesterday, prosecutors from the Southern District of New York laid out the charges against Sam Bankman-Fried, including how he used customer assets for political purposes.
And all of this dirty money was used in service of Bankman-Fried's desire to buy bipartisan influence and impact the direction of public policy in Washington.
Joined now on set by Congressman Brad Sherman. He's a member of the House Financial Services Committee, which held that hearing about FTX yesterday. Congressman, thanks for coming in.
Good to be with you.
So this seems... The true cynical way to look at this is that here is somebody who may or may not have been running a Ponzi scheme. We'll wait and find out if it is. And the best way to keep the government away was to essentially buy influence left and right. Don't buy one party, buy both parties. And this guy wrote substantial checks, did a potential Ponzi scheme for a technology that not everybody's convinced is necessary. Really? Did they use our campaign finance system to make it real?
I've been trying to ban crypto for 5 years now, and there's no lobby or PAC in town that's working for effective tax law enforcement or the anti-money laundering statutes. But it's not just Bankman, but others, but particularly him, was spreading money around on both sides. I think it's not just the money, but the promise that the whole industry is going to be there with bigger money. He spent a lot of money in primaries and lost a lot of money in primaries. I don't think he spent it all.
But this is turning out not to be his money that he may have spent,
right? And
that he may have spent investor money in this, which is another level of fraud. But what does this mean for the political entities that took this?
Well, I think some have given it to charity, but I think...
Is charity the right answer?
The right answer is back to the investors, because it was never Bankman's money.
How do you do that?
I've told a colleague or two to put the money aside and wait until the bankruptcy trustee has a fund that people can return money to, and add it to what other assets the bankruptcy trustee is able to put
he
together.
gave some, I think, $30 million in total?
No, he mostly, he gave a little.
Yeah.
He did independent expenditures,
right.
And they were he lost $7 million on backing the wrong candidate in Oregon.
Yeah. No, but he also gave a $6 million check to House Majority PAC, I believe.
Yep.
That's not an insignificant check.
That isn't, and it'll be interesting to see what that PAC does and whether the bankruptcy court can recover it.
So you want to ban crypto. Is there no positive thing that comes from Bitcoin? Do you see any positive thing that comes from Bitcoin?
Crypto is a way to evade well, right now, it's not a currency at all.
Right.
It's an electronic pet rock, and you bet that you can sell it to somebody. So my concern is it may become a currency. If a currency, it helps you defeat financial laws. Now, I want to defeat the financial laws of Iran and Russia. But to a much greater extent, I want to enforce the financial laws of the United States. And I'm up against a Republican Party, or chunks of it. Every time a billionaire successfully cheats on their taxes, a member of the Freedom Caucus earns his wings.
I get the line you're trying to say there, but with crypto, they've bought off both parties. There's significant members of Congress, left and right, that are pro-crypto here.
Those of us who are strong crypto skeptics, we've just got to play defense and let the SEC get involved. Now, it takes them a long time, and I've criticized them for not enforcing, particularly on crypto exchanges. But I don't think, for the reason you point out, I don't think we can win playing offense. I don't think we can pass good legislation.
If you regulate crypto, then you will legalize crypto forever. So, and that's, I know you want to, I mean, it does feel like, is regulating crypto actually a trap?
If you impose the anti-money laundering statutes, then you take away the one way crypto can aspire to become a currency. How it's going to compete against the dollar? What's its advantage? Crypto means hidden currency. So if you don't let them hide, if you impose on the entire U.S. portion of the ecosystem the anti-money laundering statutes, there's no reason for crypto when it goes away. It's not as good as banning it, but it's as close as we're going to get.
And is that, do you think that's the more feasible way to go, that that's where you'll get some support from folks that want to, I mean, would you accept the idea that crypto's a commodity?
Sam Bankman-Fried spent all this money for one purpose, and that was to keep the SEC out of the crypto world. And he was willing to call it a commodity. And his bill, and I've told my colleagues, don't trash Sam Bankman-Fried and then go pass his bill. So calling it a commodity and giving
you don't
it the
think
weaker,
it's a commodity?
I think it is a security. And if it's also a commodity and a second weaker agency wants to regulate it too, I'm all for that. But the purpose of calling it a commodity from Sam Bankman-Fried's standpoint was to say it's not a security and keep the SEC, the bigger and tougher regulator, out of his area.
In some ways, is the fact that there's going to be a lot of dirtied up politicians who took all this crypto money. Do you think that actually gives you more of a chance to get something passed because people want to cleanse themselves?
You don't have many, he spent money in primaries people lost, so they're not even
but
here.
he sent it to the major parties.
He sent
Every major party's committee got a big check from him.
It's not an individual. There are a few individuals who are giving back $5,000 here, $5,000 there. But as you point out, the big money was independent expenditures and to independent expenditure committees, and you don't face the same heat when your name's not on it.
Yeah, maybe that ought to change. Hey, Brad Sherman, thanks for coming in. Democrat from Southern California. Good to see you.
Good to be with you.
After the break, the Fed's year-ender, what today's interest rate hike means for the economy and you. Stick with us. Welcome back. Inflation is slowing, showing some signs of cooling. And the Fed is now showing signs of pumping the brakes a bit on the efforts to bring down prices. Today, the central bank announced a half-point rate hike. It's its seventh increase this year, but the first one that was below 0.75, bringing the rate to its... So overall, the rate's at its highest level in 15 years. But again, it was a smaller rate hike than the 4 previous rate hikes. All of this comes a day after the Labor Department reported softer than expected inflation numbers, with prices in November rising 7.1% compared to a year earlier. Sounds high. It is high, but it's actually the smallest year-over-year increase since last December. Steve Leisman is CNBC's senior economics reporter. So they telegraph this. And in some ways, Jay Powell's been very careful about telegraphing all these rate hikes. He seemed to say, we're going to get a half point. We got a half point. Now what?
Now they're maybe going to go a little slower, but they're still going to go higher. And
quarters each time?
Quarters each time. They're going to feel their way a little bit. The lights are dimmer now than they were about how clear the path is of where they need to go. They want to keep raising rates. Those numbers you just put up kind of show that, yeah, they're down, but they're still pretty high.
That's
remember
still high. I was just going to say, they're saying, yeah, best since last December. And I'm old enough to remember when last December's numbers were terrible.
Right. And you're also old enough to remember when the inflation rate had trouble getting up to 2%, yes. Right? So Fed Chair Jay Powell is not going to go to an aircraft carrier and put up a mission accomplished sign on inflation. He is a very long way from that. He is, what they did today, by the way, is even though you're right, they went step down and probably will step down again in terms of how much they raise rates, the Fed's own forecast for how far they're going to go went up higher. You put that number up again, 4.25, 4.5 is where they are now. They're going above 5%. That's their own forecast right now.
Boy, that goes back to my savings and loan when I actually got 5% interest rate.
You could do that now. Some people are looking at that and saying that's a good buy.
The good old-fashioned CD, is it going to come back?
Well, right now you can go buy a U.S. 2-year note and make 4.25%. It's better than when you're making in your savings rate, in your savings account.
Well, especially with all that crypto that we all have. these days. That's no longer.
Did you do that,
anything.
Chuck?
Kidding.
You shouldn't talk to me. I would have told you not to do it.
I'm kidding. I did not buy air.
Smart man.
I did not buy air. So it does sound like Lael Brainerd, who's the vice chair, who's been arguing, hey, we have one instrument here, and inflation may be higher for longer than we think. We can't crash the economy. Is her point of view sort of taking hold?
Hers is one point of view out there, and there are a group of people that are kind of maybe aligned with this idea of doing a little bit less. There's also a group of people that think the Fed ought to do a whole lot more.
Just rip the Band-Aid off, do this harder, harsher, go ahead, crash everything quickly, and then come back?
Well, they don't want to crash things, but what they do say, if you look at the forecast, there are 7 of them that want to go above 540, so quite a bit higher. There's this group, basically what they're looking at, Chuck, is the unemployment rate and the job market. There's a labor shortage in this country. You were kind enough to put on the series we did last week about immigration.
There's one solution to this. It's more workers.
It's legal immigration is the key. We have people retiring. We lost people, unfortunately, lost workers during the pandemic. And also, you have this immigration problem as well. People have left the workforce through retirement. If you have a labor shortage, the Fed's job is to solve the inflation problem. They have to bring demand down in commensurate with the amount of labor supply there is to service that demand.
Is our labor shortage make us right now a bit? This is why he can't pound us into a recession with these rate hikes?
That is a big reason why. You go back and look at prior recessions. They always happen with big increases on unemployment.
Always, yeah.
It's very hard.
We do expect some layoffs in the first quarter of next year.
There will be some layoffs, but look, we're at 3.7% unemployment. It's near a 50-year low. The idea of Powell and the Fed is to bring it back up to a 4.6% rate, which is more in line with where it typically is.
You know, no president's lost re-election if it went above 8%. I mean, it used to be if you were just within 5 and 7, you were okay.
That was the old days when we thought 5% was the steady state. We're now able to seemingly run the economy with a lower unemployment rate. And let's hope we get there. That's why there is some hope on Wall Street right now that we do what's called a soft landing. We bring down inflation. We have a modest growth slowdown and not a recession. And then the Fed could stop hiking and maybe even cut a little bit.
Do you imagine that the Fed would start cutting before the end of next calendar year?
It's a tough call right now, and I'm tell you why. Because I cover the Fed. Fed Chair Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve officials say they're going above 5%. Right now, the market, which takes a bet on where the Fed's going to go, they're betting on those cuts you just asked me about. So I'm betwixt and between, do I believe the market or do I believe the Fed? Here's the deal. It's very easy to tell. If inflation comes down back towards 2% and they're in a place where they're comfortable that inflation has been vanquished, then the Fed won't have to hike that much.
Yeah, I don't think we're getting at 2% next year. Anyway, Steve Leisman over at CNBC. Steve, thank you.
Pleasure.
Still to come, it was an emotional day on Capitol Hill as Club Q shooting survivors brought their messages to Congress. I'm going to talk to Brady President Kris Brown on the work still ahead in the fight against hate and gun violence. But first, we've been excited to celebrate 75 years of Meet the Press with some clips and highlights from the best television archive in news. Here's then Mayor-elect Rudy Giuliani weighing in on the future of gun safety in 1993. 2 days before President Clinton signed the Brady bill into law.
The next goal that Jim and Sarah Brady have to bring about a ban on semi-automatic weapons, a former mayor of California, now Senator Dianne Feinstein, has introduced legislation which would ban 19 semi-automatic weapons. Are you supportive of that?
Absolutely. Anything we can do, even if it isn't going to have as broad an effect as sometimes people think it will have, that will reduce the number of weapons in this country, will help cities in particular.
How about a total
and help police officers.
How about a total ban on all handguns?
I don't think you could work that out under the Constitution. I mean, it would be, as far as I'm concerned, handguns should be in the hands of police officers. Anything we can do to move in that direction, we can do. There are a lot of constitutional problems in how you get there.
Welcome back. It was a powerful day of testimony on Capitol Hill today as survivors of the shooting that left 5 dead at an LGBTQ nightclub in Colorado last month spoke in front of Congress. Michael Anderson, a bartender at Club Q, the night of the attack, called on lawmakers to take action against assault weapons like the one used by the shooter. Take a listen.
I ran for my life that night and hid, praying and hoping the violence would end. When I stared down the barrel of that gun, I realized I stood no chance against a weapon of that power, magazine capacity, and seemingly automatic firing rate. I can still hear the rapid firing of bullets today. It's a sound I may never forget. It's a sound I hope no one here or anywhere else in this country has to hear. I say all of this not because it's easy to do so, but because it's important to do so. I plead you all to appeal to your heart, your morality, and your humanity to do something about this issue.
Today's words echo those of the parents in the wake of the Sandy Hook shooting, as we mark 10 years since 20 young first graders and 6 teachers were killed. It's a plea we hear in the wake of every mass shooting, and there have been a staggering amount of them in the last decade. According to data compiled by the Gun Violence Archive, since Sandy Hook, there have been 4,277 mass shootings, with over 22,000 people killed or injured in those shootings. Just take that in a second. So far in 2022, there have been 627 mass shootings, and with 16 days left in the year, that's nearly 2 a day. Joined now by Kris Brown. She's the president of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And Kris, I don't know if you got a chance to hear our throwback in 1993 of a new incoming New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani talking about the progress being made with the Brady bill when it was signed into law a couple of days later. But when you look at the last 10 years and the lack of action, I know a lot of Americans are frustrated. You're at the Brady Center. How frustrating is it? And is there a new idea on how to get lawmakers to focus on this?
Well, thanks, Chuck. Yes, I did hear that. And obviously, as the head of Brady, we have to look at the landscape of horrific loss we've experienced in this country due to preventable gun violence, but also, frankly, the things that have happened at the state level and just this year at the federal level, passage of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act that are appreciably going to save lives. The Brady law has stopped more than 4 million sales of guns to individuals who we all agree shouldn't have them. Our frustration, Chuck, is that we have many more solutions right before us that the American people support, like expanding the Brady law, like banning assault weapons, the mass weapon of choice, unfortunately, far too often in many of these school shootings. And we need Congress to act on these. We feel good about what we're seeing in midterms in these elections, but certainly more needs to be done.
Look, at the end of the day, it's 30% of the 20 to 30% of the country who's sort of holding the rest of us hostage on gun violence, on laws to impact gun violence. Have you thought of focusing all your efforts actually on just those 30%? I mean, in some ways, we almost ignore the 20 to 30% that don't want to budge, that cause these Republican lawmakers to run away and hide on these issues. And is because they're the logjam here. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's that group of voters that is scaring the daylights out of lawmakers from doing anything.
I think you're right, Chuck. It depends on how you look at this. The other thing that's happening, and we see this from the midterms, we saw it from 2018 forward, is younger millennials and Gen Z are voting in huge number for candidates who support gun violence prevention. I think that's the truth of why we got the bipartisan Safer Communities Act through, with 15 Republicans voting yes, something that had been unthinkable, really, for anyone to do, any Republican to do in the last decade. So, yes, we need to get some of those people, I think, to come across who believe in responsible gun ownership. But let's face it, there's a certain segment there that we won't move and we can't move. The new voters, folks, the younger people like my kids who grew up in lockdown drills, Chuck, they're sick of this. They want a different kind of country. And I think the folks who are looking at these last midterms and the last two election cycles, who are in Congress, who are Republicans, understand that they either change the issue or they are losing next generation.
Are you disappointed? You know, President Biden said he was going to make one more effort at the assault weapons ban before the end of the year. Democrats still control the House and the Senate for the next couple of weeks. There's not anything they're moving on guns. Not a thing. And you and I both know whatever doesn't get done this year, not getting done next year.
I am frustrated, I'll be honest with you. I spent last week with physicians who'd flown in with the organization March 4th, founded after Highland Park, to lobby members of the United States Senate, begging them, crying in front of them about bringing that bill to the floor, Chuck. And I don't understand why it's not scheduled for a vote. I get the calendar is busy. I get that there are many things. But in the end, this will save lives. It is very important to be scheduled, and whether or not it can pass, it needs to be brought to the floor.
4,227 mass shootings since Sandy Hook, America. 22,000 people killed or maimed since we couldn't pass Manchin to me. Anyway, Kris Braun of the Brady Center. Kris, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being with us this hour. We'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. And a quick programming note, tune in tonight at 10:30 Eastern for an NBC News Now special titled Epidemic of Hate, Anti-Semitism in America. Please check that out. My colleague Hallie Jackson picks up News Now coverage straight.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.